The prison gate buzzed behind me, a sound I'd heard every morning for 2 years. Only this time, it wasn't calling me back inside. It was letting me go. The guard handed me a clear plastic bag, a silver wedding band I'd refused to remove after my husband's death, a faded photo of my son, at 10 years old, holding a crooked wooden birdhouse we'd built together, my Bible, and $27. 2 years of my life, reduced to a bag and $27. I stepped through the gate and closed my eyes as the autumn air hit my face. Most people dream about freedom while they're locked up. I stopped dreaming about it after the first year, because I'd learned something most people never do. Prison doesn't always begin with steel bars. Sometimes it begins the moment someone you love decides your voice no longer matters. Mom. I opened my eyes. There he was, my son, Daniel, standing beside a black SUV, holding a bouquet of white lilies. My favorite flowers. How ironic that he remembered what I loved but forgot to believe I was innocent. I've been waiting since 6 this morning, he said, his voice cracking. I wasn't sure you'd let me see you. I didn't answer. I just looked at the stranger wearing my son's face. He lowered the flowers. I've made so many mistakes. Mistakes are forgetting a birthday, Daniel, I said quietly. Watching your mother get handcuffed, then signing the statement that kept her in prison that wasn't a mistake. That was a choice. The color drained from his face. Before he could answer, a black sedan pulled in behind him. 2 people in dark suits stepped out, federal investigators. And they weren't here for me. They walked straight past me, toward my son. Daniel's breathing turned uneven. What are they doing here? I picked up my small bag and looked him in the eyes for the first time that morning. The truth, I said. It always arrives. I walked past him without another word. I didn't look back. Not when I heard the investigator say his name, and not when the lilies slipped from his hands and scattered across the pavement. Some people say prison changes a person. They're wrong. Betrayal does. Prison just gives you enough silence to hear your own heart breaking. Before people called me inmate 44281, I was Evelyn Brooks, Richard's wife, Daniel's mother, and caretaker of a dream my husband built with his own hands. People used to drive past Brooks Construction Group and admire the glass headquarters. What they didn't see were the early years, the nights Richard came home covered in cement dust because we couldn't afford enough workers, the mornings we split 1 cup of coffee to save for payroll. Richard never wanted to be rich. He wanted a company that never cheated anyone. Money comes and goes, he used to tell me, but your name stays on every building you leave behind. The day Daniel was born, Richard carried him through our half-built headquarters and whispered, "One day, this will all be yours." Daniel grew up wearing a tiny yellow safety helmet, collecting spare nails, following his father everywhere. When he was 8, he announced he wanted to build skyscrapers taller than the clouds. Richard knelt beside him and said something I never forgot. Never measure success by how tall your buildings become. Measure it by how many people trust the man who built them. Life was beautiful. Not perfect, but beautiful. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday, Richard kissed my forehead and said, "I'll be home by 6. A drunk driver crossed the median. He never came home again. Daniel was 19, old enough to understand death, too young to understand how fast responsibility replaces childhood. People told me to sell the company and grieve in peace. But every blueprint in that office still carried Richard's fingerprints, so I stayed not to run it better than he had, but to protect it until our son was ready. For years I served as chairwoman while Daniel studied civil engineering and worked his way up from the bottom, exactly like his father had. When he became CEO at 30, the whole company stood and applauded. I cried not because he'd succeeded, but because Richard should have been there to see it. "We did it, Mom," Daniel said, hugging me after the ceremony. "No, sweetheart," I told him. "Your father did. We just kept his dream alive." Every Sunday after that, Daniel came for dinner. He still asked for my chicken pot pie. He still kissed my forehead before leaving. For a while, I thought grief hadn't stolen my son the way it had stolen my husband. Then one spring afternoon, he called, happier than I'd heard him in months. "Mom, there's someone I want you to meet." Her name was Vanessa Hale. She arrived in a cream dress with a smile warm enough to melt winter, brought flowers, complimented my cooking, laughed at Richard's old stories like she'd known him herself. By the end of the night, I told Daniel quietly, "She's lovely." He squeezed my hand under the table. "I knew you'd like her." Looking back, The warning signs were never loud. They were whispers small enough to ignore, dangerous enough to destroy a family. The first time Vanessa visited the company, she spent 5 minutes admiring Richard's portrait in the lobby, and 45 minutes asking about board votes, company shares, and what would happen if the chairwoman ever decided to retire. Walking to the parking lot afterward, she slipped her arm through mine. "You've done an incredible job protecting Richard's legacy," she said, looking up at the building bearing my husband's name. "The hardest part about building an empire is knowing when it's time to let someone else take control." A chill ran down my spine. I smiled politely. But somewhere deep inside, a mother's instinct had started to whisper, "Real betrayal isn't one terrible moment. It's quiet, one small compromise at a time, until you wake up and realize someone's been stealing your life while smiling across the dinner table." Vanessa never challenged me directly. She was too smart for that. Instead, she became exactly what everyone wanted, remembering employees' birthdays, organizing charity events in Richard's name, being adored by the whole office. "I think Daniel finally found the right woman," our receptionist told me. I smiled and hoped my instincts were wrong. Then the little things started. Daniel stopped calling every Sunday. Dinners went from weekly to monthly to "Sorry, Mom, Vanessa already made plans." A mother doesn't notice the distance right away. She just keeps making room at the table. At a quarterly board meeting, I noticed something in the financial reports. A payment of nearly $3 million to a consulting firm I didn't recognize. I asked our CFO, Martin Ellis, who'd approved it. "The CEO's office," he said. "That didn't sound like my son. He never approved payments that size without the board." I pulled the contract. Signatures looked authentic. But the consulting company had no history, no reputation, no footprint, like it had appeared out of nowhere. Richard used to say, "When something doesn't make sense, don't panic, keep asking questions." So I did. Over 3 weeks, I dug through older reports, bank records, vendor payments, small transfers, duplicate invoices, different company names, identical mailing addresses, individually, meaningless. Together, they painted a picture that frightened me. Someone wasn't stealing once. They were draining Brooks Construction one careful drop at a time. I printed everything, locked it in my bottom desk drawer, and planned to talk to Daniel that Friday not as chairwoman, but as his mother. The next morning, I found Vanessa standing beside my desk. "I was looking for Daniel," she said, glancing around my office. "It must be difficult, working somewhere that reminds you of Richard every day." Her eyes drifted to my locked filing cabinet for a half-second too long before she smiled and left. At lunch that Friday, I slid the folder across the table to Daniel. His smile faded as he read. "Vanessa mentioned you might be doing this," he said. "She said you've been questioning employees, reviewing records without telling anyone, acting like you don't trust the people I hired." "I don't distrust your people," I said. "I distrust the numbers. Every report's already been audited. Then the auditors missed something," his jaw tightened. "Or maybe you're having trouble letting go." The words hurt, not because he disagreed, but because they didn't sound like him. They sounded rehearsed. His phone buzzed. "Vanessa." He pulled his hand from mine, said, "I think you should take some time off," and left. I sat alone with my cold coffee, realizing that for the first time in my son's life, he'd chosen someone else's voice over mine. The following Monday, I opened my bottom drawer. Empty. Every document, bank records, contracts, invoices gone. No forced entry, no alarms. Security confirmed only one person had requested after-hours access that weekend. Vanessa Brooks. Retrieving documents for Mr. Daniel Brooks. 18 minutes, according to the access log. That's all it took to erase weeks of work. I called her. She didn't deny it. "I removed unnecessary tension from the situation," she said calmly. When I told her to stay away from my son, her tone shifted. Not louder, just certain. "Daniel is exactly where he needs to be. Richard once told me, when someone works that hard to erase the truth, it's because they're preparing a lie." I didn't yet understand how right he was. By the next morning, the police were walking through our doors with a warrant bearing my name. Detectives searched my office and pulled a thick folder from my own drawer, forged contracts, fraudulent transfers, signatures that looked like mine but weren't. "Someone planted them," I said. Daniel just stared at the papers, then at me, his face filled with disbelief, as Vanessa slipped her hand into his and whispered, "Please don't make this harder than it already is." "Look at me," I told him. "Not those papers. Me. You know I would never betray your father. And he opened his mouth, then closed it. He signed the complaint. I was arrested in front of him, even after 3 nights in a cell. Even after newspapers printed my photo, under headlines calling me a fraud, I still believed Daniel would walk into that courtroom and say, "My mother didn't do this." Instead, at trial, the prosecutor laid out fabricated evidence. Millions in fraudulent payments, fake shell companies, hidden accounts, all carrying my signature. Employees testified they'd seen me acting secretive, even desperate. They weren't lying, they just didn't know why. Then Daniel took the stand. I smiled at him, the smile only a mother gives when she's silently saying, "Tell them the truth." "Did you have reason to believe your mother was responsible?" the prosecutor asked. Daniel closed his eyes. Yes. Then, because the evidence left no other explanation. I wanted to scream. Instead, I sat in silence. Because I'd spent 35 years teaching my son to respect the law, I wasn't about to dishonor that now. Even though the law had failed me. The verdict came 4 days later, guilty. 2 years for crimes I never committed. As they cuffed me, Daniel cried out, "Mom!" I leaned close enough that only he could hear. "If your father were standing here today, he wouldn't ask whether you believed the evidence. He'd ask why you stopped believing the woman who raised you." I never turned around as they led me out. Some wounds get deeper when you keep looking back. My cellmate, Martha, 9 years into her sentence, watched me stare at our cell door the first week. "Everyone does that," she said. "They think someone they love is going to walk through it and say there's been a mistake." No one came for me, not Daniel, not old friends. The world had already decided who I was. A month in, Daniel's first letter arrived. 4 sentences, ending in, "I'm so sorry." I folded it into my Bible and never answered. Not out of hate. I didn't know anymore who I'd be writing back to, the boy who fell asleep on my shoulder, or the man who'd watched them lock me away. I filled my days instead of counting them, teaching other inmates to read financial documents, remembering Richard's words, "You don't discover a person's character when life is easy, you discover it when everything's been taken away." Then Martha tossed me a newspaper. Brooks Construction loses major government contract. Executives resigning, investors nervous. The company Richard built for 30 years was crumbling. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt afraid for my son, drowning and not even sure who was holding him under. His letters kept coming, the handwriting less steady each time. The last one read, "Mom, I think you were trying to warn me." Outside, Vanessa had convinced Daniel to restructure for efficiency. Trusted executives gone, old suppliers dropped, millions still bleeding out through consulting firms he barely questioned. Then, while prepping for an audit, he found that same $3 million payment I'd flagged before my arrest. This time he followed it all the way, a shared registered agent. 3 more shell companies, every trail leading back to someone connected to Vanessa. He hired independent forensic accountants, altered emails, manipulated approvals, copied digital signatures, coached witnesses. The truth hadn't been hidden. It had been buried under manufactured proof. He confronted her at their penthouse, laid the investigation file on the table. "I know about the shell companies." She poured a glass of wine. "I wondered how long it would take. You framed my mother." "No," she said. "I gave people exactly what they were already willing to believe." Then she pulled a one-way plane ticket to Switzerland from her handbag. "I'm leaving tonight. You'll never see me again." She walked out, leaving empty rooms and the truth behind. That night, Daniel wrote his final letter. 6 words. "Mom, I failed you." I held it to my chest and cried for the first time in 2 years, because somewhere beyond those walls, my son had finally opened his eyes. Which brings us back to that morning. Daniel, older than his years, standing with white lilies. The investigators walking past him, straight to me. "Mrs. Brooks," said Special Agent Thomas Reed, extending his hand. "I wanted to personally tell you your conviction has officially been overturned. The investigation uncovered extensive evidence that financial records were manipulated, signatures forged, and witnesses deliberately misled. Your record is cleared." The weight I'd carried for 2 years finally lifted. Not because people would think well of me again, but because Richard's name, our family's name, was restored. The agent turned to Daniel. "You knowingly signed filings containing false information and gave sworn testimony based on documents you never independently verified. You'll receive formal notice to appear." "I understand," Daniel said. I'll cooperate. I deserve whatever happens. I reached into my bag and slipped my wedding ring back onto my finger. Do you know what your father feared most? I asked him. Not losing money. He feared raising a man who'd mistake trust for truth. Daniel's shoulders shook. I became that man, he said. Yes, I told him, but that doesn't have to be the man you remain. Your future is still yours to write, but you must live with the chapters you've already written. He nodded. I will. Months later, Vanessa Hale was arrested, trying to move stolen assets through offshore accounts. Years of fraud, forgery, and theft collapsed under the weight of the truth she'd built it on. Brooks Construction survived, but only after the board removed Daniel as CEO. It continued not because one family owned it, but because hundreds of honest employees refused to let one woman's greed erase decades of integrity. The board asked me to return as chairwoman. I declined. That chapter was over. Instead, I sold the family home, kept only Richard's old workshop, and used the proceeds to open the Richard Brooks Community Learning Center. Free business training, financial literacy, and mentorship for young entrepreneurs, widows, and struggling families. I wanted Richard's legacy to build people, not just buildings. Nearly a year later, a volunteer handed me an envelope with no return address. I recognized the handwriting immediately. Mom, every morning I wake up remembering the moment I chose manufactured evidence over the woman who raised me. Prison taught you patience. My consequences are teaching me humility. I don't ask you to erase the past. I only hope that someday, when you think of me, you remember the boy who wanted to build skyscrapers with his father, not just the man who failed his mother. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to become someone worthy of carrying Dad's name. I love you. Daniel. I folded the letter into my Bible, beside the photo of a 10-year-old boy holding a crooked birdhouse. Some wounds never fully heal, but they don't have to define the rest of your life. Standing outside the learning center, watching children laugh over a model bridge they were building, I could almost hear Richard's voice. Measure success by how many people trust the man who built it. I smiled toward the sky and whispered the words I wished my son had understood before it was too late. Your greatest inheritance was never the company, Daniel. It was your father's character. That's the only fortune worth rebuilding. I closed my eyes, not as a woman who'd been imprisoned, not as a mother who'd been betrayed, but as someone who'd finally learned that justice isn't always revenge. Sometimes justice is simply the truth arriving before hope dies.